Escape North, the story of Harriet Tubman. Escape North. The night was dark. Cricket song filled the air. A woman hid outside a cabin. She whistled a song called Go Down, Moses. A line in the song said, Let my people go. Inside the cabin, the slaves knew that Harriet Tubman had come to lead her people out of slavery. Slavery는 노예제도입니다. It was 1851. Harriet Tubman was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad. It was the name people gave the route taking slaves north to freedom. Years before a slave had run off, he had seemed to disappear right in front of his owner's eyes. It must have gone on an underground railroad, said the owner. The story spread. There was a way north to the free states. There were people who would help. They would hide you in their homes. These safe houses were stations on the Underground Railroad. Runaways ran from station to station until they reached a state where slavery was against the law. 네, 노예제도가 법으로 금지된 곳으로 다시 말하면 프리 스테이츠를 찾아서 북쪽으로 가는 노예인들의 도망을 도피에 대한 이야기입니다. That Saturday night, 10 slaves answered Harriet's call to freedom. Field slaves had Sundays off, so the bossman wouldn't know they were gone until Monday. Then he and his dogs would come after them. If they were caught, they would be beaten, maybe to death. Harriet was there to make sure that didn't happen. She kept her eyes on one star in the sky, the North Star. She moved quickly, and the runaways followed. Suddenly, clouds covered the star. Harriet had to make sure she was heading in the right direction. If she didn't, they could end up back at the plantation. Harriet ran her fingers over the bark of the tree nearest her. Daddy Ben had taught her that most grew on the north side of trees. I will have to find the north the way my daddy taught me, she thought. Harriet closed her eyes and thought back to the lessons of long ago. She thought back to when she was a girl. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Rose in about 1820. As a child, she was called Minty. Later, she took the name Harriet after her mother, who was called Old Rit. Harriet was born a slave on a tobacco plantation in Maryland. She and her family were the property of a man named Edward Brothers. That meant they had little say over their own lives. They could even be sold or separated from each other. Harriet's family lived a small cabin near the master's house. It had no windows and only a bare earth floor. The family slept on beds made of straw. They used rags for blankets. They didn't have much to eat. Harriet didn't go to school. Slaves weren't allowed to learn or read or write. Instead, she helped her mother cook. She carried buckets of water to the slaves working in the fields. She picked insects off tobacco plants. When Harriet was 7, she was sent to work for a neighbor, Mrs. Cook. Mrs. Cook made Harriet wind yarn all day. Sometimes the yarn broke. Then Mrs. Cook got out the whip. "You stupid girl," she yelled. "I'll show you what real work is." Mrs. Cook sent Harriet to work for Mr. Cook. Day after day, Harriet stood in the swamp, checking muskrat traps. Finally, she got sick, and Mr. Cook took her home. When she was well, Mr. Brothers sent her into the tobacco fields. In the fields, slaves worked all long hours in the hot sun. If they didn't work fast enough, they were beaten. It didn't seem fair to Harriet. Sometimes she looked up at the sky and watched the birds flying north. She promised herself that one day she too would fly north to freedom. The accident. When Harriet was a teenager, a slave working in the fields ran off. The bossman threw a weight at him to stop him, but it hit Harriet instead. Harriet wasn't the same after that. She fell asleep without warning. Sometimes her head would drop in the middle of a sentence and she would be asleep. These sleeping spells made escape even more dangerous, but Harriet's mind was made up. Daddy Ben, her father, knew Harriet would run. He wanted her to make it when she did. He showed Harriet where to hide in the woods. She showed her which plants and berries were safe to eat. He taught her how to run quickly and silently through the forest. Most important, he taught Harriet how to find the north. "See that big dipper in the sky," said Daddy Ben one evening. Harriet picked out the stars that formed a dipping ladle. "See that bright star above the bowl?" asked Daddy Ben. "That's the North Star. Follow it and you will be heading toward freedom." 4. Harriet Escapes. Years went by. Whenever Harriet lost her heart, she looked up at the North Star. When she was 28, Harriet fell in love with John Tubman. Slaves weren't allowed to marry, so they jumped the broom instead. A broom was laid on the floor. The couple jumped over it. When they landed, they were husband and wife. Harriet told John her plan to escape. "I have a right to freedom or death," she said. "I will have one or the other, since no one is going to bring me back alive." John didn't want trouble. He said he would tell Mr. Brothers if Harriet kept talking about running away. Harriet stopped talking about it, but she didn't stop thinking about it. One day, Harriet found out that she had been sold. It was time to act. Weeks before, a Quaker woman had offered to help. Quakers were religious people who believed that owing another human being was wrong. The woman gave Harriet directions to a safe house in Delaware the next day over. The next Saturday, Harriet waited until John was asleep. She wrapped cornbread and salt herring in a handkerchief. She silently opened the cabinet door. Outside, the North Star pointed away. Harriet didn't look back. She took off into the woods, running fast.